Good afternoon. Welcome again to the American Presidency series. This lecture concerns the second part of our lecture of our materials on public opinion. This lecture will focus exclusively on public approval of the American president. Public approval, of course, is important from the standpoint of presidential power. Presidents who have strong approval ratings tend to be more successful than presidents who have weak approval ratings. Presidential approval, it is generally acknowledged, gives the president more power when approval ratings are high. But approval ratings are something that has been used extensively both as a dependent variable. There are many studies on what determines presidential approval ratings. We'll talk about some of that material in the latter part of this lecture. There are also many studies that use presidential approval as an independent variable. How does presidential approval affect X or Y? And so the materials in this session are important areas of political science research and important to your understanding of the American presidency. That said, let's go ahead and launch right on into the lecture materials. I'm going to share the screen with my computer now. And the title of this lecture is The President and Public Opinion, Part 2. And as I note here, it is largely about public approval of the president's job performance. Gallup has been asking a question about, do you approve of the job the president's doing since the late 1930s? And it became consistently asked in the late 1940s. So we have a very long time series of data on presidential job performance and how the public feels about how the president is doing in his job. Presidents seek a favorable job approval rating from the public. As I noted, job approval translates into power along various dimensions, including in Congress and with regard to controlling the general agenda of the media in Congress. It generates respect for presidential leadership. Aggregate approval of the president's job performance is dynamic. For this reason, it may not be very useful to simply look at averages over an entire term. Nevertheless, here's a table from Gallup reporting averages for each president from Truman through Trump. Let's go ahead and click this link and go to that website. And like my cursor is lost, but I found it again. Okay, so here we are at the Gallup website, and we have presidential approval ratings, historical statistics and trends. And here's a table that lists presidents from Harry Truman up through Donald Trump. And we have on the far right here their average approval while they were in office. Truman averaged 45.4%, Eisenhower 65%, Kennedy in his short term of roughly 2.5 years, 2 3/4 years, averaged 70%, Lyndon Johnson 55%, Richard Nixon 49%, Gerald Ford 47%, Jimmy Carter 46%, Ronald Reagan 53%, George H.W. Bush, the father, 60.9 or 61, Bill Clinton 55, George W. Bush 49, Barack Obama 48, and Donald Trump 41. You can see that Trump averaged the lowest of any president in this sequence. But you can also notice that there are a lot of presidents, as we'll mention later, who average below 50%. Okay, so here we have first term in office averages. This pertains to the president's first term. Some presidents didn't have a second term, for example, Carter and Ford and Trump didn't have a second term. Neither did Kennedy have a second term. And so you can see that these numbers differ from what we saw up above. Approval is higher for the first term of presidents. Of course, Jimmy Carter only had one term. Barack Obama had 2 terms, but he only averaged 49 in that first term. Donald Trump had 1 term, he averaged 41. Here's the second term averages, and you can see here a tendency. Truman's second term, his average was only 37%. Eisenhower's second term averaged about 61%, Johnson 50. Nixon during the Watergate period averaged 34. Reagan averaged 55, a little bit higher than in his first term. Clinton averaged 61. George W. Bush only averaged 37. Why would that be? Well, the economic crash that occurred late in his term, and also the unpopularity of the war in Iraq. Barack Obama averaged about 47% in his second term. And here we have a table containing the president's highest approval rating. You can see that the highest approval rating for Truman was 87, Eisenhower 79, Kennedy 83, Lyndon Johnson 79, and it looks like highest approval ratings are much higher than the averages. Donald Trump 49. He never got above 49% during his 1 term in office. Low approval rating. The winner here on low approval rating was, voila, Harry Truman. His low approval rating was 22%, registered in February of 1952. Next, we find Richard Nixon at the peak of Watergate, or the trough of Watergate, averaged 24%. Jimmy Carter, during the Iran hostage crisis, his low approval in June of 1979 was 28%. George H.W. Bush, the father, averaged only 29% in July of 1992. This would have been after his no new taxes pledge was violated. And then George W. Bush, 25% in October of 2008. This would have been due to the economic crash. And Trump's low approval rating was 34, which was much higher actually than some of the other presidents. And then we have on this page the trends in approval associated with each president. Notice a pattern here, a downward trend in approval for each president. Bill Clinton actually had a slight upward trend. George W. Bush had a big downward trend. Barack Obama had a downward trend and then an upward trend in his approval ratings. So 7 presidents since World War II have averaged approval less than 50% over their entire terms. Truman, Nixon, Ford, Carter, George W., Obama, and Trump. However, as we noted by looking at the highs and the lows a moment ago, this set of averages can be misleading because there can be a lot of variation on a month-to-month basis in a president's approval rating. The averages hide a lot of variation within presidencies that are very significant to understanding the president's job approval. For example, look at the differences between first and second terms on the page that we just looked at, and the highs and lows on the page that we just looked at. See also the trends for each presidency on that page. So a lot of variation is hidden simply by looking at the averages. On the next page, we have graphs of presidential approval by month since World War II. The data come from a hot link that I've got there. But let's look at the data. You can see here we've got each president from Truman all the way through Biden, and you can see that you had a really high start for Truman after the death of Franklin Roosevelt. This would have been April of 1945, and but look what happens to Truman's approval rating. It declines, and it hits a low during the Korean War. Eisenhower took over from Truman, and you see a huge jump in presidential approval at that point. Eisenhower's approval remains fairly steady, but declines in this period here, and is at a fairly low point at the end of his presidency. And we'll talk about the reason for this decline a bit later. But Kennedy had the highest approval, highest average approval of any president, but you can see there's a lot of variation in Kennedy's approval. It drops in a pretty precipitous manner until his death in November of 1963. Johnson takes over, and you can see he starts high, and you get a decline all the way to 1968 when Nixon is elected president. Johnson refuses to run again in 68, so you get an increase during Nixon, and then a sharp decline during Nixon all the way up through Watergate. This is Watergate right here. You get Ford, a big high in approval, but quick decline in approval. And his approval stays below 50% during this period. You get Carter, starts high, declines sharply due to the Iran crisis, and Reagan is elected, and then Reagan's approval declines, increases again, declines due to the Iran-Contra scandal, and then his vice president, George H.W. Bush, is elected the presidency, and so you get a sharp increase in approval. His approval stays high up through the Gulf War, and the declines right after the Gulf War quite precipitously. Clinton is elected, and Clinton is the only president in this series who experiences a long-term secular increase in approval. So you can see Clinton starts low and ends pretty high in approval. Bush, due to September the 11th, moves high and declines precipitously from there on out. Obama starts relatively high and declines, and then increases again. And then here you see Trump, and then finally the short period that we've had Biden in the presidency. And so that's presidential approval for all presidents from Truman through Biden. Where do we get presidential approval data? Well, we have a lot of sources besides Gallup. One, maybe the easiest source to use from a graphical perspective is the Gallup Interactive approach. Let's go there. Okay, Gallup has something called the Presidential Approval Center. And the graph that we looked at on the preceding page is shown here. Notice there's an interactive aspect to these data. This is for all presidents, but we can pick particular presidents and track their approval ratings. For example, let's pick Lyndon Johnson as a president and look at his job approval rating. And you can see that Johnson's approval rating starts off at 78%. And when he leaves office, it is only 49%. And it has been lower during this series. And so we can look at specific presidents' approval we can look at their disapproval. And then let's go back to approval. We can also look and break it down by politics. Democrat, this is Johnson's approval among Democrats. You can see that it's well above 50% for all Democrats. Here's Johnson's approval for Republicans. You can see that it starts off high and ends up very low for Republicans. Here is Johnson's approval for independents. And you can see that it starts high and ends pretty low for independents. And we can also look at whether or not the respondents are the presidents of their own party. And you can see this is pretty high. And then you can look at whether the president is of the opposing party. And you can see that this is lower. So let's go back to all adults. We can also, using this interactive graphing capability here, we can also add a comparison. So here's Johnson. We're going to pick Johnson again. Okay, and then we're going to pick job disapproval among all adults. So we have a comparison here of approval versus disapproval. And you can see that disapproval is only 2% in December of 1963. This is the month after Kennedy was assassinated. And disapproval climbs and reaches a peak around 1968, in March of 68, and then drops off again. And you can see from this that there are a lot of possibilities using this for graphing the very rich approval data that we have at the Gallup Center. If you want to copy these graphs, they don't make it very easy, but one approach is just to take a screenshot of the graph that's shown here and copy it. That's what I've done in the earlier parts of this lecture. So that's one source of approval data. Probably the richest source is the Gallup approval data. Another source is the Roper Center. And let me get my cursor back. There it is. There it was. Yeah, there we go. We're going to go to the Roper Center now. And earlier we talked about the Roper Center in last lecture. So they start out with Joe Biden's approval rating. Let's pick a different president here. Let's go back to Johnson again. So here's what we saw for approval and disapproval on Lyndon Johnson. You can use their tool here for highs, viewing the highs and lows of the president, or you can use their graph builder that will enable you to look at multiple graphs. Note that the data that's given here is not simply the polling that is done by Gallup, but is a combination of all polls on presidential approval that are aggregated together for each data point on this time series. Okay, let's go back to our lecture. So Roper Center is another source for the data. Yet another source is the American Presidency Project, which is maintained at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Let's close out these other two. And here we have presidential job approval for Donald Trump, or we should have there. Let's refresh the page. Okay, there we go. And we have the approval and disapproval for Donald Trump from start to finish. And you can see that his approval rating was consistently lower than his disapproval rating for his entire term in office. You can also see the same data for Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Clinton. And you can also, an advantage here, you can look at the data actual data. So if you want to work with the actual data that is used to construct these graphs, you can click the view the data link, and it'll give you the data in an Excel spreadsheet, and you can see the approving, disapproving, and unsure data in that spreadsheet. So if you need the actual data, it's available there on the website maintained by the American Presidency Project. And I find that useful in the sense that I do some work sometimes in which I actually study presidential approval, and I need the actual data in order to conduct statistical analyses rather than simply look at graphs. And so that's another source of presidency data. Note that Trump's approval ratings were the lowest of any president for the duration of his presidency. My cursor keeps disappearing here. There it is. Okay, here's Trump's approval rating from Gallup. You can see highs and lows and various data points along this path, but his approval rating never got above 49%, with a low of about 34% during the last part of his presidency. Of course, this 34% was after he was defeated in the 2020 election, and there was a difficulty with the turnover of power with Trump supporters attacking the Congress and attempting to stop the counting of the electoral votes in Congress. Some call it an insurrection. It is certainly the first time in American history that the transfer of power has not been peaceful. And so that's a hallmark, if you will, that will always be present for the Trump administration. Okay, here's Trump's approval and disapproval ratings from Gallup. And note that the only time during Trump's presidency when his approval exceeded his disapproval was when he started doing coronavirus briefings at the White House. His disapproval rating went back to the norm for his presidency after his disinfectant suggestion. Recall that he suggested that people ingest disinfectant in order to do away with the coronavirus. Implication of this, people look to the president for leadership during a time of crisis. When they don't get it, the president doesn't get credit. Here is Joe Biden, first part, and you can see that Biden's first period, January of 2021, he starts with 57% on day 13 of his office. Notice that it has declined by the 26th day of his office. I'm sorry, this is actually the 26th week in office to 50%. And so here's where we are at the time of this lecture. It'll be interesting to see if it falls below 50 or increases above 50. And so that's what we have with the current president. Okay, so how do people arrive at their evaluations of the president? More generally, what determines presidential approval ratings? One strong indicator of people's assessment of the president's job performance is party ID. Research in political science shows that there's a partisan basis for public approval of the presidents. Democrats overwhelmingly approve of a Democratic president. Republicans overwhelmingly approve Republican presidents. So party ID is a very important indicator of approval of the president at the individual level. We're looking at individual level data. Polarization along party lines in approval and disapproval. The public was increasingly polarized along party lines, starting with the Reagan administration. On average, the polarization along party lines has been about 40%. During Reagan, it was about 52%. Now it is even higher at around 75%. So if you compare approval ratings for the in party versus approval ratings for the out party respondents, right now you get about a 75% difference. In an earlier era, it was less than 52%, usually averaging about 40% or even less than that during the kinder, gentler era, if you will, that we're currently in. Independents represent a group that increase the variability in approval for the president. Independents, that is, people who have no affiliation to either political party, tend to be less polarized in their approval or disapproval for the president, running down the middle between Democrats and Republicans, though not always the case, as we'll see. Okay, here's a graph I constructed of Republican approval, Democratic approval, and independent approval. Notice that Republican approval is in red, Democratic approval is in blue, and independent approval is in green. And you can see that independent approval lies between Republican and Democrat approval. Notice also the switching nature of partisan approval. During strongly approving eras, you have a president of the same party affiliation as the Republicans. When the Democrats take over, you see Republicans become less approving. When Republicans get back in power, they become more approving, and so forth for this. And you can see that, that this pattern follows through consistently for the entire set of time series. The point is that there is a partisan basis for presidential approval assessments. And we can predictably forecast what's likely to happen to presidential approval when party control of the White House shifts. Even Donald Trump received over 80% approval from Republicans, but only less than 10% approval from Democrats. Note in the earlier era that we were talking about, here we are back in the Eisenhower administration. The difference between Republicans and Democrats was far less. You have a difference here from about 55%, 85%, a little more than that. So a difference of around 35% between Democrats and Republicans. Again, what we're observing here with this variability from back to front is the emergence, if you will, of polarization of the political parties in our system. Here we see partisan approval of the president from the standpoint of is the respondent of the same party as the president or from the opposing party to the president. And in orange, what we have is the in party. In green is what we have is the out party, where respondents in the survey are aggregated by whether or not their party holds the presidency or not. And you can see here a big difference in party and out party approval of the president, though you see large variations in party and out party approval of the president. For example, here, what we see is the decline in Johnson's approval as a result of the Vietnam War. And what you see right here is the decline in party approval due to Watergate. And here you see the decline in presidential approval for the in party due to the Iran hostage situation. And so here, what we see is the decline in approval following the first Gulf War and so forth. So the big differences in partisan approval of the president, though the variations are still there. Okay, with regard to partisan approval or with regard to presidential approval, there is a positivity bias. What is positivity bias? Presidents are almost always evaluated positively at the start of their terms. People give them the benefit of the doubt at the start of their terms. Moreover, approval tends to go up substantially between the time of the election and over the first few months of a presidency. So we call this a positivity bias. It's a phenomenon that occurs at the very start of each presidency. It's not present for all presidents, but it is for almost all presidents, as you'll see with the data in the next few slides. Okay, here we see the start points for presidencies from Eisenhower through Biden, and notice that I've drawn a line for the start points of each presidency. Notice that corresponding with this line, we have a big increase in approval. Here's a big increase. Here's a big increase. Here's the end of Nixon, the start of Ford, big increase. End of Ford and start of Carter, big increase. End of Carter, start of Reagan, big increase. End of Reagan, start of George H.W. Bush, big increase. Here we have Clinton, big increase. And notice that Clinton is climbing in approval as opposed to virtually all other presidents who are declining in approval. Okay, here we see a big increase. Actually, at the start of Bush's term, you see not so much a big increase. Here you see September the 11th. I'm sorry, this is the first Gulf War. I'm sorry, this is the invasion. This is September the 11th. I had it right to begin with. Okay, and then notice that Bush's approval rating declines sharply. And then we have Obama, a very sharp increase. And then we have Trump. Trump is an anomaly. Notice that at the end of the Obama administration and the transition to Trump, presidential approval actually drops. And that's counter to every single presidency start that had existed from Eisenhower all the way up to Obama. Notice also that Trump's approval rating stays consistently below 50%, but when Biden is elected, you can see presidential approval goes significantly above 50%, 57% to be specific. Okay, here's a graph that a graph that I put together which compares the electoral percentage, the popular vote that the president got, and then the president's first month approval rating, and then the change in approval from the prior president. What this graph is illustrating is that positivity bias that I alluded to in the prior slide. So you can see here, Eisenhower was elected by 55%, but his first month approval was 67%. Kennedy, barely elected at 50%, 72% approval. Johnson, 61 elected percent, but his first approval rating was 71%. Here you see Nixon, 43, 60, 50, 66, Reagan, 51, jumps to 55, Bush 1, 53, jumps to 61, Clinton, 43, jumps to 58, Bush, 48, jumps to 62, Obama, 53, elected by and jumps to 67. And so we see an average for all these prior presidents of being elected at 50.7, but their approval rating on average jumps to 64%. But here we have, this is from a paper that I was doing, have been doing. Trump elected by 46%. You see a drop in approval rating to 42%. And interestingly, we can add Biden to this table. Biden was elected by 51.3%, and his approval jumped to 57%. And so the only president from this group that did not obtain a positivity bias was Donald Trump. Notice also the stark difference between the approval from the prior president to the new president. Eisenhower jumped by 35%. Obama jumped by 33%. Biden jumped by 23%. Johnson 20%, and so forth. You can see that there's a really stark difference between the approval rating of the prior president and the newly elected president for all presidents except, guess who? Mr. Trump. Approval actually declined by 12% for Trump from Obama's ending approval to Trump's starting approval. And so that's a way of looking then at the positivity bias. Okay, there is something called a honeymoon effect. The honeymoon effect alludes to the persistence of presidential approval after initial election. And in this graph, what I've done is I have marked the honeymoons that each president received. The honeymoon in this graph is defined as occurring if the president's approval rating remains consistent and not sharply declining for a number of months. So you can see that it's variable with the presidency. Eisenhower's honeymoon was fairly short-lived, but he maintained really high approval ratings, even though his honeymoon dropped off. Kennedy had a good honeymoon. You can see the duration of it here. Johnson's honeymoon. Nixon. Ford received no honeymoon. He wasn't elected either. Carter. Reagan received a fairly long honeymoon. Bush. Clinton. Bush 2. Obama. And then we get to Trump. No honeymoon with Trump. The data for Biden is not long enough to actually construct the honeymoon period for Biden. But in any case, what we have with the honeymoon is the idea that presidential approval ratings remain high at the start of a presidency for a variable number of months. You can see from this graph that presidents early on receive longer honeymoons than recent presidents have. It'll be interesting to see how long the honeymoon for Biden is. Okay, we noted earlier that there's a tendency toward decline in presidential approval ratings through time. Why would that decline exist? Well, one hypothesis would be that there is a lack of trust in government that is persistent and has been persistent since Vietnam and Watergate. Whatever it is, what I did was I took the data for each president and I regressed those data on time and constructed a slope coefficient associated with each president. And so the slope of decline for Eisenhower was minus, I need to put a minus sign there, minus 0.14. Kennedy, minus 0.52. Johnson declined really sharply, minus 0.71. 0.45. Ford, there's no real slope for Ford. So he didn't get the honeymoon, he didn't get the decline. Carter, negative 0.58. Reagan had a slight increase of 0.04. Bush 1, a really precipitous decrease of 0.74. This is the largest decrease for any president. And then look at Clinton here. Clinton actually has an increasing approval rating through time and significantly increasing. through time. Where Reagan, the increase was only 0.04 and not statistically significant. For Clinton, it was 0.19 and highly statistically significant. Bush 2, very sharp decline, minus 0.52. Obama, minus 0.45. And then Trump, slight increase through time, 0.08. And again, not statistically significant. And also all the data is not here for Trump because my series ended in around 2018 at the time I constructed the data. Okay, there's also a relatively constant factor for most presidents that explains the average level of approval. Things like personality and style and perceived ability enter into this equation. However, these things are not dynamic, they're fixed. We might compare Kennedy to Nixon, for example. Kennedy viewed as having a really strong and attractive personality. His style was appealing. He was perceived as being a very good politician. Compare that to Nixon. He was a shifty personality. His style was reckless, and his perceived ability was not perceived very highly. And so we can compare Kennedy to Nixon and come up with the idea that Kennedy's approval rating was higher because of these personality attributes. Again, though, that is speculation, isn't it? We're imposing our views, if you will, of personality on the data, and that's probably not the best approach to use as scientists here. Okay, the economy is an important factor in determining presidential approval. Clinton's mantra was, "It's the economy, stupid." And he said this repeatedly during his presidency. The state of the nation's economy is the single most important factor driving aggregate presidential job approval. Earlier, we talked about individual level job approval. The single most important factor there is partisanship, political party ID. But if we think about aggregate public approval, the factor that is most important in driving president's job approval is the nation's economy. Presidents are held accountable for the economy, regardless of whether they inherited a good or a bad one. For example, Obama's approval was punished for the economy that he inherited from George W. Bush. He needed to get the economy moving again from the deep recession that Bush left, and he was punished for that poor economy at the start of his term. Okay, here's some evidence to this effect. What I did was I looked at periods when the economy was in full employment defined as the statistical number given by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The shaded areas in this graph represent periods, time periods, when the economy was at full employment. Notice from this graph that the approval tends to be high during periods of full employment. So here you can see we're in full employment, and then here we see Johnson's being punished for Vietnam. Here we see a period of full employment, and Nixon being punished for, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Nixon is being punished. Johnson is being punished for Vietnam. Here we see a period of full employment starting in January of 2000, ending in January of 2001. And Clinton is being rewarded for full employment here. Here we see a brief period of full employment. And here we see another period of full employment. Generally, presidential approval tends to be, on average, higher during periods of full employment. And this is not a rule, though. It's not a law that approval will be higher during periods of full employment, but you can see here, for example, that Trump received no benefit on average from his period of full employment. The entire period of the Trump presidency was a period of full employment. So on average, approval tends to be higher when the economy is doing well. Okay, here's the flip side of that. Here we have economic expansions and contractions, with the shaded areas representing periods of contraction, as defined by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Okay, so look at the pattern here. Here we see decline during this period of contraction, or recession, if you want to call it that. Here you see decline during recession, decline. Oops. Here you see decline. Here you see decline, and then Nixon resigns and decline again. Okay, this is Carter, and it declined sharply during the 80 recession. Here you see Reagan, starts out really strong, but then the 82, 83 recession occurs, period of sharp decline. Here you see George H.W. Bush during the 1992 recession. Here you see Obama. I'm sorry, not Obama, but George W. Bush. And then finally, you see Obama during a period of recession. Actually, an election occurs here. This is George W. Bush here. And then Obama during the contraction gets a big boost in approval, but then drops off very, very sharply due to bad economic conditions. So we can put this into a table like I did earlier. What I have here in this table is approval ratings for presidents during periods of economic expansion and contraction. And on the left-hand column here, I have the overall average for the president across his entire presidency. The cycles is the number of economic contractions that occur during a presidency. The president's average approval during expansions, average approval during contractions, and the total drop in approval during contractions. So you can see that presidential approval is always higher during expansions relative to contractions, with the exception of Bush 1. Bush 1 actually benefited from the Gulf War in that regard. And here you can see that Bush 2 benefited from 9/11, but notice that there's a big difference between the contraction average and the expansion average for Bush 1. Obama, there were no economic contractions during Obama. The average change for contractions relative to expansions for presidents are about 6 or 7%. Trump didn't have a contraction. His average during during the expansion of 2017 through 2020 was about 40%. Okay, another factor in determining presidential approval is so-called rally events. What are rally events? These are dramatic events that affect the largest dynamic in public approval. Things like the Oklahoma City bombing, the start of the Persian Gulf War, the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon, the assassination attempt on Reagan in 1981, the invasion of Grenada, negative images flowing from Somalia, September the 11th, the invasion of Iraq. We can demonstrate the effect of rally events graphically Before we do, though, we should also note that scandal can be a rally event, and it may affect approval. It may not affect it, though, in the logical direction. Watergate and the Iran-Contra scandal depressed approval, respectively, of Nixon and Reagan. In contrast, Lewinsky-gate either increased Clinton's approval or had no effect on approval, depending on your method of calculation. Lewinsky-gate certainly was a scandal, but it didn't hurt Clinton's approval at all. Okay, here's a graph I've constructed in order to illustrate the effects of dramatic events and the economy on presidential approval. We'll start over here on the left. You can see we're looking at a couple of recessions. You're at a dip in approval. Vietnam, Watergate, Nixon resigns is a rally event. Here we see the Iran hostage crisis for Carter. Here you see the assassination attempt on Reagan, and we see two recessions, both corresponding with lows in presidential approval. Actually, we see a third recession here. Here we see the first Gulf War. I call it Kuwait on this graph, reflecting a large increase in approval. September the 11th, recession, the Iraq invasion, and then we have Trump, and no further drama events from there on out. You can see here the effects of both drama events and the economy on approval in this graph. Okay, another factor affecting approval is presidential honesty, integrity, intellect, leadership, capability. These are all dynamic and can enter into the way the public perceives the president. Nixon and Watergate was an indication of presidential honesty. Carter was perceived as a weak leader when he had no ready solution for the Iran hostage crisis. George H.W. Bush was perceived as vacillating when he went back on his pledge of no new taxes. He was considered weak. And Whitewater and the media coverage of various other issues hurt perceptions of Clinton along this honesty, integrity, intellect dimension. Bush, too, was generally perceived as dishonest in the reasons for invading Iraq. Obama was perceived as a weak leader, probably due to his inability to get things relating to the economy approved in a partisan Congress. Recall that Mitch McConnell said that nothing would get approved during the Obama administration. Trump was perceived as dishonest and pretty much a loose cannon, who was psychologically unfit for the presidency. Perceptions of Biden. It's probably too early to tell along this dimension. Is he honest? Does he have integrity? Is he high in intellect? We're seeing a lot of media coverage of his forgetfulness and that sort of thing. Whether it's true or not is a matter that probably is beyond the media coverage, and so we'll leave that to you to think about. Okay, thinking about Biden, though, we do have some opinion data on Biden. One question that we looked at earlier in the preceding lecture, it says, in the news you're getting about the Biden administration, are you seeing more about Joe Biden's character and leadership skills or Biden's positions and the agenda? And the policy positions and his agenda is getting the most news coverage, but you're seeing about 27% of respondents are saying they see a lot of positive things being reported about Biden's character and leadership skills. Another question, with Joe Biden as president, do you think the overall level of ethics and honesty in the federal government will rise, fall, or stay the same? 46% say it will rise, 30% say it will fall, 24% say it will stay the same. So ethics and honesty is a fairly positive thing for the Biden administration. Issues can affect presidential approval. For an issue to affect approval, three things have to be present. One is that the issue needs to be salient. That is, it must be important to large numbers of people. People need to care about the issue for it to affect presidential approval. Things like the economy, or the environment, or foreign policy events would be categorized along this salience dimension. A second thing that needs to occur for an issue to affect presidential approval is valence. That is, within issue areas, bad news may outweigh good news in capturing the public's attention. Bad news about the economy tends to have more impact on president's approval ratings than good news about the economy, as you saw in the preceding graphs. Third, in order for an issue to affect public approval of the president needs to be deemed as responsible for the issue. People need to see the president as responsible for the issue, and thus, for example, people don't gauge the president necessarily on the issue of child molestation or something like that, because presidents are not really responsible for things that occur individually or at the local level. So presidential performance on the issue must be seen as responsible. Okay, in summary then, public approval of the president can be a result of many things, but quantitative scholars such as me do a fair job of explaining the aggregate series that we showed earlier using only a few variables. One, honeymoons, simply regressing the president's approval rating on time, as I did in the earlier graph. Secondly, economic performance, and you can see that approval tends to co-vary quite well with measures of economic performance. We demonstrated that with the graphs earlier. And then finally, rally events. Rally events being those drama events such as a crisis or a scandal. Okay, so let's stop the sharing now and summarize and think about where we're going now. In this lecture, we have devoted all of our time exclusively to a discussion of presidential approval. We've talked about why presidential approval is important. We've talked about why the approval ratings matter to the president, why the presidents care about their approval ratings. They pertain mostly to the president's power relations with respect to the rest of the system. We've also in this lecture talked about what determines presidential approval ratings at length. We've looked at what they are, where they come from, and then we finally looked at the determinants of presidential approval ratings. Okay, with that said, then let's think about the future. From here, we're going to take a quiz on all of these materials and then segue into the remainder of the course. We've been in Module 5, and we will adjourn from there into Module 6, which pertains to the president's personality and the president's the president as part of an institution. Okay, so we'll stop there and adjourn for this period.